My son faked a school shooting, and I laughed my ass off. I was at work when my phone buzzed. It was my son's teacher. Miss Williams, your son has staged an active shooter incident. You need to come immediately. I almost choked. Joey was a rule follower, the type to remind me to put my seatbelt on. I left 3 patients waiting and drove to Central High. The drive was 30 minutes, but I made it in 20. Students stood shivering in gym shorts outside, parents frantic, teachers trying to console them, and then I saw him. My son sat on the curb, wrists zip-tied, surrounded by officers. Inside the principal's office, the accusations poured out like bullets. Your son brought a replica firearm onto the campus. He emailed threats to teachers from an anonymous account. He triggered fire alarms and shouted warnings. Students cowered under desks for 40 minutes, Miss Williams. Police entered classrooms with guns drawn. He terrorized this entire community. The worst part was I couldn't even defend him. In the photos and reports, there was a black pellet rifle, copies of his threatening emails to other students, and CCTV footage where you could faintly see someone who resembled my son in the hallway, just seconds before the shooting. Other parents filed into the emergency meeting, faces twisted from pity to disgust when they heard Joey's name. One mother actually stepped back from me as though my son's madness might be contagious. I knelt in front of him, ignoring the officers, ignoring everyone. Joey, what did you do? Why? His wrists flexed against the plastic ties. His eyes stayed level on mine, because no one listened. Joey inhaled slowly, and I watched my straight-A son transform into a prosecutor presenting evidence. On October 4th, I was fixing computers when I noticed Larry, the assistant principal, had left his desktop unlocked. Joey's voice was quiet now, like it was a memory that hurts him to even think about. There were video thumbnails visible on his screen, girls in the locker room, taken from multiple angles during practice hours. I took screenshots of everything and reported it to Vice Principal Garcia within 10 minutes. He shifted slightly on the chair, the zip ties cutting into his wrists. She told me I must have misunderstood what I saw and warned me about spreading dangerous rumors that could ruin careers. The principal moved closer, but Joey continued. On October 20th, 3 girls from the swim team went to Coach Williams, saying they felt like someone was watching them during practice. He dismissed their concerns as paranoia and told them to focus on improving their times instead of making up stories. I recognized those names, the O'Brien twins and Yasmin Ali. They'd all been strong swimmers. So, obviously, I emailed the school board with the screenshots, but they didn't even bother responding. I grabbed my son's hand as the police officers glared at me. It took 2 weeks for me to get an automated reply saying my message would be reviewed at their next meeting. His hands flexed against the restraints. On November 15th, my friend Emma suddenly quit the swim team. She wouldn't explain why, but started having panic attacks whenever she had to go near the pool for PE. 2 more girls quit that week, and Coach Williams told everyone they were weak. The gathered parents had fallen completely silent. Even the officers seemed to be holding their breath. Last Thursday, I stayed late for robotics club. At around 9 p.m., I saw Larry in the girls' locker room with a ladder, adjusting something in the ceiling tiles. Joey finally looked directly at me, and I could see the weight of what he'd been carrying. Mom, Sia just made JV swimming. She's 13 years old. The implications hung heavy in the air between us. I wasn't going to wait until it was her turn to be victimized. I knew a lockdown would bring police, and not just school administrators. I wanted full SWAT teams and bomb squads to search every inch of the building. They wouldn't be able to quietly remove the cameras before independent investigators found them. I couldn't make anyone care any other way. The principal's face drained of color when an officer returned with a radio. Sir, during the sweep, the team found hidden devices in the girls' locker room ceiling. Looks like cameras. A lot of them. 3 days later, FBI agents carried out 17 cameras and boxes of memory cards. 6 years of footage. 67 victims were identified. Larry had done this at 3 different schools before. Joey never got his scholarship back. The expulsion stuck. MIT doesn't admit students who once caused a fake school shooting, no matter how noble their intentions. But I didn't care, because one way or another, they were going up pay. I'd make sure of it. That evening after the FBI finished hauling out the last box of evidence, Joey and I sat at our kitchen table with the overhead light making everything look too bright and harsh. The house felt empty even though nothing had been taken from us. Just that heavy silence that comes after cops and agents have been through your space. Joey's wrists had red marks from the zip ties, and he kept rubbing them without seeming to notice he was doing it. We didn't talk for almost an hour, just sat there with cold coffee getting colder while the clock on the microwave blinked because I'd never fixed it after the last power outage. Finally, I grabbed a legal pad from the junk drawer and slammed it on the table hard enough to make Joey jump. I told him we were going to write down everything. Every single report he made, every meeting, every adult who ignored him, because if they thought they could sweep this under the rug after what he gave up, they had another thing coming. Joey nodded and started talking while I wrote, dates and times and names filling page after page until my hand cramped. The next morning, my phone started buzzing at 6 a.m. with message after message, most from parents calling Joey a terrorist, saying we should leave town, that he was as dangerous as any real shooter. But between all that hate, 3 different moms texted me to say their daughters had finally told them what happened in that locker room, and they wanted me to know they were grateful, even if they couldn't say it publicly. I screenshot every single message, the ugly ones and the grateful ones, saving them in a folder I labeled evidence, because you never know what you'll need later. By Friday, the official letter came from the school district, thick envelope with their logo stamped on it like they were proud of what was inside. The hearing notice called Joey a violent hoax perpetrator and said he posed an ongoing risk to student safety. And I actually laughed out loud at the kitchen counter because they were still more worried about covering their asses than admitting what they'd allowed to happen for years. That weekend, I barely slept, instead spreading papers across the dining room table and creating a timeline with every email Joey sent, every meeting he requested, every dismissal from every adult who should have protected those girls. The folder got thicker and thicker with screenshots and dates and names of people who'd failed these kids, and Joey helped me organize it all into tabs while we listened to true crime podcasts, because because somehow that felt appropriate. Monday morning, I drove to Helena Frey's office in the fancy part of downtown, where all the law firms have marble lobbies and security guards who look at you funny if you're not wearing a suit. Helena specialized in Title IX violations and institutional negligence, and she reviewed our documentation with these sharp eyes that reminded me of a hawk spotting prey from way up high. She flipped through pages faster than I thought anyone could actually read, but then she'd stop and tap certain parts with her pen, already seeing angles and strategies the school district wouldn't expect. After 2 hours of going through everything, Helena leaned back in her leather chair and explained the harsh reality that Joey's good intentions wouldn't erase the policy violations, that the expulsion would probably stick no matter how right he'd been about Larry. But she also said there were paths forward for holding the adults accountable, the ones who'd ignored clear warning signs, and her voice got this edge to it that made me think she'd been waiting for a case like this. That afternoon, Gustavo Fitch from the FBI called about maintaining chain of custody for all our evidence, warning me that any media attention could mess up the criminal case against Larry. I bit my tongue so hard it hurt because all I wanted was to scream the truth from every rooftop in town, but I knew he was right about needing to be careful. When Jamal Goldman from the local paper called 20 minutes later, I declined an on-record interview, but made sure to mention how interesting it was that the school board hadn't said one word about Joey's prior reports to administrators. I could hear him typing on the other end of the line, and he said he'd do some digging on his own, which was exactly what I'd hoped he'd say. 2 days later, the district spokesperson Emerson Hartley released this statement praising the school's swift cooperation with law enforcement and talking about their commitment to student safety, without mentioning that Joey had tried to report this for months before taking desperate action. My hands shook with fresh anger reading it on my phone, and I had to walk around the block 3 times before I trusted myself not to drive to his office and tell him exactly what I thought of his PR spin. Meanwhile, Sia had started refusing to go to PE class, too scared of the locker room even though all the cameras were gone, and her mom called me crying because she didn't know how to help her daughter feel safe again. I emailed Sia's counselor that same day requesting accommodations for her, determined to protect at least one kid from more trauma since the adults at that school had already failed so spectacularly. Joey walked into that office ready to drop truth bombs like he was testifying before Congress, turning from zip-tied troublemaker to star witness faster than you can say hidden camera scandal. The next week, Joey's expulsion pre-meeting happened in the same conference room where they'd first accused him. The principal sat across from us with this stack of papers, tapping his pen while he talked about disruption to the learning environment and how Joey's actions traumatized hundreds of students. I cut him off and asked for copies of every incident report filed in the past year. His pen stopped tapping. He said those were confidential personnel matters. I said Joey's reports about Larry weren't confidential when he made them, so why would other reports be different now? The principal's face got red and he shuffled through his papers faster. He kept saying Joey violated 17 different policies and created an unsafe environment. I kept asking about the unsafe environment Larry created for 6 years. The meeting ended with nothing resolved, but I saw how his hands shook when I mentioned getting my own lawyer. Helena worked fast after that meeting. She sent formal preservation letters to the district and school board by certified mail, explaining they were legally required to maintain all documents related to Larry's employment and any complaints filed during his time there. The letters warned about criminal penalties for destroying evidence. She made sure copies went to every board member's home address too. No convenient computer crashes or missing files allowed now. She also filed notices with their insurance companies because she knew they'd want to protect their own interests. 3 days later, I sat in the courthouse for Larry's arraignment. He wore a cheap suit and kept his head down while his lawyer entered a not guilty plea. The judge set bail at $200,000. In the hallway afterward, I overheard 2 prosecutors talking about similar patterns at previous districts. One mentioned something about a school in Ohio and another in Tennessee. My stomach turned thinking about all those girls, all those years, all those adults who must have known something. That same afternoon, I drove to the district office and filed public records requests for Larry's complete hiring file and any complaints filed during his employment. The clerk behind the desk took my forms without making eye contact. Her expression told me she'd been expecting someone like me. She stamped the papers and gave me a receipt that said they had 30 days to respond. I filed the same request with his 2 previous school districts that day. The next morning, Joey's MIT scholarship committee sent an email. No phone call, no meeting, just a cold email saying his admission was withdrawn pending outcome of criminal proceedings. No opportunity for a hearing or explanation. Joey read it on his phone at breakfast, and his face just crumbled. I held him while he cried for the first time since this whole thing started. His whole body shook, and he kept saying he knew this would happen, but he did it anyway. All those years of perfect grades and robotics competitions and science fairs gone because he couldn't let them hurt Sia. Helena came by that afternoon to discuss our options. She sat at our kitchen table with her legal pad and explained how civil cases like ours could take years to resolve. She warned about possible retaliation from the district, like sudden code enforcement on our house or problems with my nursing license. She said they'd try to make our lives difficult enough that we'd give up. I told her I had nothing but time and nothing left to lose. Joey had already lost MIT, so what else could they take? That evening, Joey finally opened up about the moment he decided the fake shooting was his only option. He was sitting in robotics club working on servo motors when he saw Sia walk past the door with her swim bag. She was laughing with her friends, excited about making the team. He said he kept thinking about Emma's panic attacks and the other girls who quit. He thought about those thumbnails on Larry's computer. His voice broke when he said he couldn't let Sia become another Emma. He couldn't sit there building robots while knowing what was waiting for her in that locker room. He said he tried everything else first, but nobody would listen. A week later, the district denied our records request, citing personnel privacy exemptions. Helena had expected this and immediately prepared an appeal with more specific targeted requests they couldn't legally refuse. She requested records of any complaints complaints specifically related to student safety, any disciplinary actions taken, and any communications between administrators about Larry. She knew how to word things to get around their exemptions. While Helena fought the legal battles, Jamal published his first article explaining Title IX obligations and how schools are legally required to investigate reports of sexual harassment. He laid out the timeline of Joey's reports and the administration's failures to act. The comment section started shifting from anger at Joey to questions about the administration. Parents wanted to know what else had been ignored. Some started sharing their own stories about complaints that went nowhere. The article got picked up by the state education blog and then by a national education website. 2 days after the article came out, Gustavo called from the FBI. He explained that identifying victims across multiple schools had triggered additional federal resources. They were bringing in specialists who dealt with institutional abuse cases. He said they'd found similar patterns at Larry's previous schools, and the investigation was expanding. He asked for patience while they built an airtight case. He said these things took time, but they were taking it seriously. I forced myself to trust the process even though every day felt like a year. 3 weeks passed before Joey's expulsion hearing finally got scheduled. The district sent us a thick packet of procedures and warnings about recording devices not being allowed. Helena reviewed everything with us the night before, marking key points with sticky notes and reminding Joey to stay calm no matter what they said. The hearing room was smaller than I expected, just a conference table with district officials on one side and us on the other. The district counsel started immediately, his voice sharp as he read from prepared notes about the panic Joey caused and how SWAT teams had to clear every classroom with weapons drawn. He kept using words like terroristic and malicious, while Joey sat perfectly still beside me. When it was finally Joey's turn to speak, he pulled out a folder and started reading dates and times in a steady voice. October 4th at 2:47 p.m. Initial report to Vice Principal Garcia about explicit images on Larry's computer. October 6th at 8:15 a.m. Follow-up email with screenshots attached. October 20th at 3:30 p.m. Documented conversation with principal about swim team concerns. November 2nd, formal complaint to the school board with evidence. November 15th, second complaint with additional documentation. The district council tried to interrupt, but Joey just kept reading, his voice never changing as he listed every single attempt he made to report what was happening. My chest felt tight watching my son lay out proof that nobody listened until he forced them to. The hearing ended without any decision, just a promise they'd notify us within 5 business days. That afternoon, Helena got copies of all the documents the district submitted as evidence, and I spent hours going through every page looking for anything we could use. That's when I found it buried in Larry's personnel file, just a tiny footnote referencing an alternative professional reference from his previous district instead of the standard recommendation letter. I showed Helena, and she immediately added it to our list of records to request, saying those alternative references usually meant something went wrong but got covered up. Joey helped me organize the papers, and that's when he started talking about MIT for the first time since the rejection came. He said he didn't really miss the school itself, or even the prestige of going there. What hurt was losing the robotics team he'd been planning to join, the kids who thought like him and built things that mattered. He missed having a place where he belonged, where being smart and caring about details was normal instead of weird. The way his voice cracked when he said he'd never find that again made my heart break in a whole new way. Helena called 2 days later saying she'd organized a meeting with parents of victims who wanted to discuss next steps. The community center room was packed, maybe 30 parents all dealing with what happened to their daughters. When Helena introduced Joey and explained his role in exposing everything, the room split hard. One father actually stood up and shook Joey's hand, saying his daughter finally felt safe knowing someone cared enough to stop it. But then a mother near the back called Joey as bad as Larry, saying he traumatized innocent kids for his hero complex. Another parent said Joey should be in jail for what he put their family through. Helena tried to keep things focused on the legal case, but the meeting turned into parents yelling at each other about whether Joey was a hero or a criminal. We left through the back door when someone threatened to call the police on us just for being there. The next morning, Emerson sent out a district-wide email announcing a listening session for concerned parents, but the registration form made it clear only pre-screened questions would be allowed. Helena told us to sign up anyway because sometimes the real conversations happened in the parking lot after official meetings ended. She was already planning which parents to approach privately about joining our lawsuit. 3 days later, Gustavo called with an update on the federal investigation. They'd found evidence of Larry's behavior at 2 previous schools. Same pattern every time, with complaints getting buried and him moving on with clean references. Smart move bringing up those old reports when the principal tried playing the confidentiality card. Nothing makes paperwork suddenly become public interest quite like catching someone in their own rules. Helena sending those preservation letters to board members' homes. The investigation was expanding to include administrators at multiple districts, but he couldn't share more details yet. He said these cases took time to build properly, especially when they involved multiple jurisdictions and dozens of victims across several years. Meanwhile, Sia's accommodation request went through without any announcement, just a quiet approval letter saying she could do independent study for PE instead of using the locker room, but she still walked to my car every afternoon, grabbing my arm the second she saw me and not letting go until we got home. She'd started sleeping on our couch most nights, telling her parents she was helping Joey with homework, but really just needing to be somewhere she felt safe. Small victories like keeping one kid from daily panic attacks felt hollow when so many others were still scared to even walk past the pool area. Jamal called that weekend saying another parent had shared school board emails they'd gotten through a different records request. He found the phrase minimize district exposure in multiple messages about Larry's situation, always in discussions about how to handle complaints quietly. The board members kept talking about liability and insurance costs instead of student safety. One email actually said they needed to avoid creating a paper trail that could be used against them later. My anger turned into something harder and colder reading those words, knowing they'd chosen protecting themselves over protecting kids. That night, Joey finally talked about the guilt he'd been carrying since the fake shooting. He said he could still see his classmates' faces when they thought there was a real shooter, the way they cried and shook and held each other. He felt sick knowing he caused that fear, but he refused to apologize for the outcome because those cameras would still be there if he hadn't acted. He owned both parts of what he did, the harm and the help, accepting the moral complexity of his choice in a way that showed more maturity than any administrator in this whole mess. Helena used all this information to file our formal Title IX complaint the next week, laying out how the district repeatedly failed to investigate reports of sexual harassment and assault. She started scheduling interviews with swimmers willing to talk about their experiences, and each story added weight to our case. Girls described feeling watched, finding excuses to skip practice, changing in bathroom stalls instead of the locker room because something felt wrong even if they couldn't prove it. Their parents cried hearing details their daughters had been too scared to share before. Every testimony made me more determined to make the district pay for what they'd allowed to happen. The expulsion decision came exactly 5 business days later, upheld with no changes despite all Joey's documentation of his reports. 2 days later, Emerson called asking to meet privately at a coffee shop downtown. He looked tired sitting across from me, stirring his coffee while avoiding eye contact. He leaned forward and told me the district's insurance company was actually calling all the shots on their legal strategy. They were more worried about liability payouts than fixing anything. I told him those insurance executives never watched their son lose everything for doing the right thing. His face went red, but he just nodded and left money for both our coffees. That Friday, Gustavo organized a briefing at the federal building for all the victims' families. The conference room filled with parents and their daughters, some girls as young as 11. He explained how the criminal process would work, walking through court procedures step by step. He showed slides about victim impact statements and what to expect during testimony. Looking around that room at all those damaged kids made my chest tight with anger. Some girls sat pressed against their mothers, not making eye contact with anyone. Others stared at the floor the whole time. One girl started crying when Gustavo mentioned evidence collection and had to leave with her dad. These weren't just case numbers or statistics. They were real kids whose lives got torn apart while adults protected each other. The following Monday, we started therapy with Samara Fraser at her office near the hospital. She specialized in something called trauma from institutional betrayal. Joey sat stiff in the waiting room chair, arms crossed. He didn't want to be there, but agreed to try learning ways to handle the anxiety that kept him awake most nights. Samara had this calm way of talking that made even Joey relax a little. She didn't push him to talk about feelings right away. Instead, she taught him breathing exercises and something called grounding techniques. She gave us homework sheets to practice together at home. Joey rolled his eyes but took them anyway. Meanwhile, Jamal had been digging through public records for weeks. He called that Wednesday with something big. Every single one of Larry's previous resignations included non-disclosure agreements with suspicious timing. He'd leave right after complaints started getting serious. The districts would pay him to go away quietly and sign papers promising not to sue. Then they'd give him neutral references so he could get hired somewhere else. The pattern went back 15 years across 4 different schools. It was never about protecting kids. It was always about protecting the district's reputation and budget. During our 3rd therapy session, Samara had us do this exercise where we wrote down our biggest fears. Joey stared at his paper for 20 minutes before writing anything. When he finally shared it, his voice cracked. He said his biggest fear wasn't about college or his career being ruined. It was that everyone would always see him as the dangerous kid who brought a gun to the school. That label would follow him forever no matter what the truth was. People would Google his name years from now and that's all they'd find. The kid who staged a fake shooting. Not the kid who tried to protect others. Not the kid who reported abuse multiple times. Just the dangerous one with a gun. A week later, the formal expulsion appeal decision arrived by certified mail. Helena came over to read it with us. They upheld the expulsion again, but opened this tiny window for one more appeal in 60 days. Helena said we'd keep fighting through every possible channel. Joey just shrugged and said maybe it was better to let it go. He seemed almost relieved to stop hoping for something that probably wouldn't happen. Helena wasn't giving up though. She filed subpoenas for Larry's complete hiring records from all his previous schools. The district immediately filed a motion to quash, claiming something called executive privilege. They said personnel records were confidential and couldn't be released. Helena laughed when she read their filing. She said they were scared of what those records would show. The legal chess game dragged on with motions and counter motions. Each filing cost money and time while nothing actually changed. I was exhausted just trying to keep track of all the different cases and deadlines. Saturday afternoon, I was buying groceries when a woman approached me near the frozen foods. I recognized her from swim meets but couldn't remember her name. She looked around nervously before pulling me aside. Her daughter had reported concerns about feeling watched last year. She'd gone to the principal directly. Nothing happened except her daughter got moved to a different PE period. She was too scared to go public now, but wanted me to know we weren't alone. Other parents had tried to raise concerns and got shut down too. She squeezed my hand and walked away before I could even respond. The district's listening session happened that Tuesday night in the high school auditorium. They'd sent out rules saying only pre-approved questions would be allowed. Parents had to submit them in writing 3 days before. But when the meeting started, nobody followed those rules. Parents stood up shouting questions about safety protocols and background checks. One dad demanded to know how many other complaints got buried. A mom asked why Coach Williams still had a job after dismissing girls' concerns. The crowd got louder with each non-answer from the board. Emerson stood at the microphone sweating through his suit jacket. His hands shook holding his prepared statement. Finally, he gave up on the script and promised they'd hire an external investigator to review everything. The crowd kept yelling, but at least it was something. The next morning, Gustavo called to manage expectations about this external investigator. They wouldn't have access to any of the sealed federal evidence yet. The criminal case took priority, and nothing could compromise that. The investigator would only see what the district chose to share with them. Real accountability would take months or maybe years. The system moved at its own slow pace while kids suffered right now. Joey heard me on the phone and just shook his head. He knew nothing would really change. That weekend, Joey finally admitted he'd been dodging his friends for weeks because he didn't know how to act normal around them anymore. He'd ignored texts from his robotics team and made excuses when they wanted to hang out. I suggested we start small with just pizza and video games at our house next Friday. Joey agreed, but I could see the anxiety and how his shoulders tensed up. 3 of his closest friends came over, and at first everyone just sat there awkwardly holding game controllers. Then one kid made a joke about the school's new metal detectors being slower than dial-up internet, and Joey actually laughed. They played games for hours, and nobody mentioned the incident or MIT or anything heavy. When they left, Joey seemed lighter somehow, like maybe he could still have pieces of his old life. Monday morning, Jamal's new article hit the front page of the local paper, and my phone started buzzing immediately. The district playing hot potato with Larry across schools for 15 years is like watching the world's worst game of musical chairs, where nobody wants to stop the music. He'd connected the dots between Larry's behavior at 3 different schools, with sources confirming administrators at each place had received complaints. The article included quotes from former teachers who'd tried to report concerns and got shut down. He'd found employment records showing Larry got glowing recommendations despite leaving each school suddenly. The online version went viral within hours with over 10,000 shares by lunch. Parents were posting it in every local Facebook group demanding answers. Helena called that afternoon saying the article gave us leverage we didn't have before. She'd secured a protective order from the judge allowing victims to submit statements for our civil case without using their real names. The girls were terrified of being identified publicly, and this small protection meant everything. Helena spent the week collecting these anonymous statements, and each one made me angrier at how long this went on. Wednesday morning, Emerson called asking for an off-the-record meeting at a coffee shop downtown. He looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes, and his hands shook holding his cup. The insurance company was considering settling with the victims to avoid a massive lawsuit, but they explicitly excluded Joey from any settlement offer. They claimed he wasn't a victim since he staged the incident himself. The unfairness of it burned in my chest, but Helena said later this was actually progress because it meant they were scared. Thursday was Joey's appointment with Samara, and for the first time he came out looking calm instead of drained. She'd helped him identify what triggered his panic attacks, like sudden loud noises or being in crowds. They'd practiced grounding techniques where he counted objects he could see or focused on his breathing. That night he slept through without waking up screaming for the first time in months. I heard him snoring softly through his door and almost cried from relief. Friday we filed Joey's appeal with all the supporting documents Helena had gathered. Samara wrote a letter about his mental state and decision-making process. Gustavo provided a carefully worded statement confirming Joey had reported the cameras multiple times before the incident. The packet was thick with evidence showing Joey tried every proper channel first. Helena said not to get our hopes up, but at least we'd done everything possible. Joey spent the weekend writing his own statement for the appeal and wouldn't let me read it until he finished. When I finally saw it, my hands shook. He took full responsibility for the fear he caused his classmates and teachers. He acknowledged the trauma of thinking there was an active shooter, but he also defended his decision, saying he'd rather be expelled than let more girls get hurt. His words showed more wisdom and moral clarity than any adult involved in this mess. The external investigators' preliminary report came out the following Tuesday, and it was exactly what we expected. They faulted the district's supervision protocols and response procedures, but stopped short of naming any individuals. The report used passive language like concerns were not adequately addressed, instead of saying who ignored them. It was progress technically, but not the justice we needed. Jamal wasn't done though, and his next article dropped like a bomb Wednesday morning. He'd gotten emails through a public records request showing a board member specifically told HR to keep Larry's reference neutral to avoid potential litigation from him. The board member worried Larry might sue for defamation if they mentioned the complaints. They chose protecting themselves legally over protecting kids. The corruption wasn't just negligence, but active choices to enable a predator. Helena called an emergency meeting with 2 other law firms representing victims that afternoon. They'd decided to coordinate their cases into a joint litigation group for more leverage. Together, they represented 43 families, which meant the district couldn't ignore them or drag things out hoping people would give up. The lawyers would share evidence and strategy while maintaining individual cases. Helena said this collaboration changed everything, because now the district faced organized opposition instead of scattered complaints. By Friday, the superintendent announced his early retirement, citing health concerns, though everyone knew the real reason. The board scheduled a special session to discuss personnel matters, which meant more people were about to lose their jobs. Joey watched the news coverage without any satisfaction, just a tired acceptance that at least something was happening, even if it came too late for him. Gustavo called Monday morning with news about Larry's case, and I could hear the frustration in his voice. He explained that Larry's lawyers were pushing for a plea deal to avoid the publicity of a trial with dozens of victims testifying. The prosecutors seemed willing to negotiate because trials with this many victims often became media circuses that re-traumatized everyone involved. I wanted Larry to face every single girl he hurt in open court, but Gustavo reminded me that most victims just wanted it over with. The appellate hearing for Joey's case got scheduled for the following Thursday, and Helena prepared us for what to expect. The 3-judge panel would review Joey's expulsion based on written briefs with limited oral arguments from both sides. We drove to the courthouse early that morning, and Joey wore his only suit, which was already getting too small for him. The district's lawyer spent 20 minutes arguing about deterrence and how they couldn't allow any student to stage fake emergencies regardless of motivation. He kept using phrases like dangerous precedent and copycat incidents, while Joey sat perfectly still beside Helena. When our turn came, Helena methodically walked through every report Joey filed and every adult who were ignored him. The judges asked pointed questions about the district's failure to investigate, and one judge seemed particularly interested in the timeline. After 90 minutes of arguments, they said they'd issue a written decision within 2 weeks. We waited in Helena's office when the decision came down, and she read it to us slowly. The panel removed the terroristic threat language from Joey's record, which would help with college applications later, but they upheld the expulsion itself, citing egregious disruption to the educational environment as sufficient grounds. It wasn't the victory we wanted, but Helena said it was better than nothing for his future. The district's lawyers reached out about settlement negotiations the next day, which Helena had been expecting. They offered to fund therapy for all identified victims and implement new reporting procedures with independent oversight, but they refused any admission of liability or wrongdoing, which made my blood boil. Helena advised me to think practically about what would actually help the victims while I wanted to burn the whole system down. She pointed out that trials could take years, and many families just wanted resources for their daughters now. Meanwhile, Emerson was apparently working behind the scenes to push certain administrators toward retirement. Helena heard from other lawyers that the union was fighting hard to protect people like Vice Principal Garcia, who ignored Joey's first report. The same unions that were supposed to protect teachers were now shielding the adults who failed to protect children. Jamal published another article that Thursday examining the proposed reforms and pointing out massive gaps. He'd consulted with child safety experts who said the district's proposals lacked enforcement mechanisms and accountability measures. His article included quotes from parents demanding real change, not just paperwork and promises. The public pressure started building again, with people showing up to board meetings and demanding answers. Parents who'd initially blamed Joey were now asking why nobody listened to him in the first place. That weekend, Samara surprised us by offering to write Joey a recommendation letter for community college applications. She'd been working with him for months and wanted to help him move forward with his education somewhere. Her letter addressed his actions honestly, while emphasizing his moral courage and analytical thinking abilities. She wrote about his dedication to protecting others, even at tremendous personal cost to himself. She included specific examples from their sessions showing his emotional intelligence and capacity for growth. I cried reading her draft because someone finally saw Joey for who he really was beneath all this mess. Gustavo called again the following week to confirm Larry had agreed to plead guilty to multiple counts. The deal included mandatory prison time, though less than if he'd gone to trial and lost. Most importantly, it required lifetime registration as a sex offender and banned him from working with minors ever again. The victims would be allowed to give impact statements at sentencing if they chose to participate. Some families wanted that chance to confront him, while others just wanted to forget. Helena met with the other victim attorneys to discuss the settlement offer, and they'd reached a consensus. They recommended accepting the therapy funding and oversight provisions while keeping individual claims separate. This meant Joey's specific case against the district for retaliation could proceed independently. The settlement would provide immediate resources for victims without preventing us from pursuing justice for Joey. The district sweetened the offer slightly by adding funding for independent monitoring of their compliance. We signed the settlement papers in Helena's conference room, with Joey reading every single page first. He asked smart questions about enforcement and what would happen if the district didn't follow through. Larry's lawyers pushing for a plea deal to avoid facing dozens of victims in court? That's like a vampire asking to skip the mirror test because reflections make him uncomfortable. Helena assured him there were provisions for the court to maintain jurisdiction over implementation. The board meeting that week brought the expected leadership transitions announcement that everyone knew meant forced resignations. 3 administrators would be leaving, including Vice Principal Garcia, who first dismissed Joey's report. But Emerson survived, which frustrated me even though he'd been trying to help recently. He stood at the podium promising quarterly public reports on safety improvements and new accountability measures. Parents in the audience weren't satisfied and kept demanding to know how this happened for 6 years. The board president kept repeating prepared statements about moving forward and learning from mistakes without taking real responsibility. The meeting ended with nothing resolved, and I drove home feeling like I'd wasted another evening listening to empty promises. 2 weeks passed before the mail brought something that made my hands shake. Joey had applied to the Community College Honors Program without telling me, and the thick envelope meant good news. He opened it slowly while I watched him scan the acceptance letter that mentioned a clear transfer path to State University after 2 years. It wasn't MIT, but seeing hope return to his eyes made my chest tight with relief. The program director had written a personal note saying she'd followed his case and believed second chances mattered. Joey folded the letter carefully and put it on the fridge next to his old robotics team photo. 3 months crawled by before Larry's sentencing date arrived at the federal courthouse downtown. I spent days writing my victim impact statement, crossing out words and starting over until I had 3 pages about how institutional silence lets predators hunt freely. The courtroom was packed with victims' families, and I stood at the podium with my voice steady even though my knees felt weak. I talked about administrators who chose their careers over children's safety, and how every word ignored report was permission for Larry to continue. Joey sat in the gallery but declined his chance to speak, telling me later his actions had already said everything that needed saying. Larry got 8 years, which felt like nothing compared to the damage he'd caused. The next week brought news that made me want to scream when Coach Williams received only a formal censure and mandatory supervision. The teachers' union had protected him like they always did, arguing he couldn't be fired for not acting on unproven concerns. At least now there was a paper trail following him, and any future complaints would get real scrutiny. Helena called that afternoon with a new strategy, filing a narrower lawsuit focused specifically on how the district retaliated against Joey for whistleblowing. She explained this approach had better legal precedent and avoided the complications of the broader case. The paperwork was dense, but basically argued Joey was punished for reporting crimes which violated federal whistleblower protections. She warned it could take years to work through the courts, but I'd learned patience tasted better than giving up. Spring brought unexpected good news when Jamal won a regional journalism award for his investigation into our district's failures. The judges specifically noted noted how his coverage had sparked statewide policy reviews and forced other districts to examine their own reporting systems. I sent him a thank you card with a gift card to his favorite coffee shop because good journalism had kept this story alive when everyone wanted it buried. The district finally did something right when Emerson launched a public dashboard showing complaint statistics and resolution rates updated monthly. Parents could now see how many reports were filed, how long investigations took, and what outcomes resulted without revealing victim identities. Trust would take generations to rebuild, but at least there was transparency where secrets used to hide. Joey started spending Saturday mornings at the library teaching a younger kid from his old robotics team basic programming skills. The boy's parents had asked if Joey would mentor him informally since he couldn't be an official coach anymore. Watching Joey explain circuits and coding with genuine excitement reminded me who he really was beneath all the trauma and legal battles. His patience with the kids' mistakes and celebration of small victories showed his teaching gift hadn't been destroyed. I found myself accepting this different life we were living now, where Joey's path had changed, but his integrity hadn't. Every week I added documents to our case files, keeping meticulous records of everything while watching him slowly rebuild his confidence through small steps. He'd never be the boy who was going to MIT, but he was becoming something else, maybe something stronger. Justice felt incomplete with Larry's sentence too short and administrators keeping their jobs, but our family was intact and growing stronger through the fight. The community college professors already knew Joey's name from his acceptance essay about choosing conscience over comfort. Some days were harder than others when I'd see his old classmates posting about their university acceptances, but then I'd watch him teaching that young robotics student with genuine joy and remember that integrity matters more than institutions. We weren't done fighting and probably never would be, but we were still standing, and that counted for something. Man, time really does fly when we're in it together, right? Appreciate you letting me crack a few jokes while we watch this whole thing play out. Catch you in the next one, and don't forget, like the video, it helps more than you think.